Ever get the feeling, like sometimes, that the best stories, the most fascinating ones, are kind of hidden, tucked away? Like in those footnotes of history nobody ever reads.
Right. You mean like they almost got lost along the way?
Exactly. And get ready, because today we're diving into one of those stories. It's about a lesser-known chapter in Jesus' life.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the story?
Well, it involves his travels through Phoenicia, and it's detailed in the Urantia book in paper 156.
Ah, that's a fascinating section. And it doesn't get talked about as much as some of the other parts of his life, does it?
That's putting it mildly. The traditional accounts, they kind of, gloss over this whole period.
Almost like it didn't quite fit the narrative, you know?
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. So we're talking about the year 29 AD, June to be precise. Things back in Galilee, they were getting intense. There was growing opposition to Jesus. And let's be real, he and his followers, they needed a break.
Makes sense. Who wouldn't?
Right. So they slip away to Phoenicia, which is modern-day Lebanon, looking for a little refuge, a little breathing room.
And it's there, among the Gentiles, far from everything familiar, the landscapes, the traditions of Galilee, that something interesting happens.
What's that?
Jesus' teachings. They land in a surprisingly receptive way, like way more so than back in Galilee. It makes you wonder, why wouldn't this period be, highlighted more in later accounts?
It's almost like they wanted to downplay it. Like you said, it didn't fit the narrative.
It's a head-scratcher, for sure.
Now, before we get too far ahead, we have to talk about Norana.
Oh, yeah. What a character. She knew what she wanted and was not afraid to go after it.
Talk about a woman who understood persistence.
She really puts on a clinic, you could say, about approaching faith with, a mix of audacity and, am I allowed to say humor?
Oh, absolutely. Her story is hilarious in parts. Okay, so picture this. Norana, this Syrophoenician woman, hears Jesus is in the area. Her daughter is suffering from, well, at the time it was described as a terrible nervous disorder.
And back then, they didn't really have the same understanding of these things like we do now, did they?
No, not at all. Back then, people often attributed these kinds of things to demonic possession.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so what does she do?
So she's determined to get Jesus' help for her daughter, right?
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, Jesus is exhausted. He's been teaching and healing for months. It's been intense.
Understandably, he probably just wants a nap.
Right. And he specifically asked for some downtime. No interruptions.
Makes sense, take a break, recharge. But Norana, she's got other plans.
Oh, yeah, she's not one to take no for an answer. So she shows up at the house where Jesus is staying, and get this, she's turned away.
By Jesus himself.
Well, not directly. At first, it's the disciples who turn her away. But she doesn't give up. She tries again and again.
Wow, persistent.
She even ends up having this, witty banter back and forth with Simon Zelotes.
No way, Simon Zelotes, that's amazing. What they talk about?
Well, Simon, he's trying to explain, in his own way, why Jesus wouldn't heal a Gentile's daughter, because of the whole cultural divide back then. And he says something like, it's not right to take food meant for the children and give it to the dogs.
Oh boy, here we go.
Right. But Norana, quick as a whip, she shoots back this line, yes, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.
Oh, she got him there. She didn't back down. I love it.
She's basically saying, hey, I'll take whatever I can get.
She's claiming her place at the table, but with a sense of humor. That must have been something to witness.
Oh, I bet. And here's where it gets really interesting. Jesus, he hears all of this going on. And instead of being offended, by her persistence or whatever, he's moved.
Moved by?
By her faith. By her unwavering belief, and let's be real, by her quick wit. So he comes out, and check this. He doesn't even need to lay a hand on her daughter. He just looks at Norana and says, oh, woman, great is your faith. Your daughter has been made whole.
Wow, just like that.
Yep. And guess what? The Urantia book says that her daughter was healed from that very hour.
Amazing. Now, you could listen to this story and think, oh, it's about persistence or it's about faith. And yeah, those are there. But I feel like there's something deeper here.
Oh, I totally agree. So what do you think the deeper message is? What is it about Norana's approach that gets through to Jesus when others couldn't?
It's like her humor, her refusal to be put in a box, to be intimidated by religious hierarchy or whatever. It's like she breaks through those barriers that so often keep us, separate from the divine.
I see what you mean. She's not letting those social conventions stop her.
Right. She embodies this spiritual boldness, this playful irreverence that honestly I think even surprised Jesus.
It's like she met him on equal footing, challenged him, And in doing so, she revealed the depth of her faith.
Exactly. And this encounter, it speaks to a theme that keeps popping up throughout Jesus's time in Phoenicia, this openness of the Gentiles to his message.
Because they didn't grow up with all the same baggage,
Right.
the expectations, the fears.
Right, they're hearing it with fresh ears.
And that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
So we've got this really interesting thing going on, right? The Gentiles, they're like breath of fresh air, and they seem way more open to Jesus's message than some of the folks back home.
It's like all that tradition, all those expectations, they can be kind of a barrier sometimes,
Totally. And this whole dynamic, it really comes to a head as Jesus and his crew continue north along the Phoenician coast. They end up in this bustling port city, Sidon.
Sidon! That was a major hub back in the day, wasn't it? Full of traders and merchants from all over.
Oh, yeah. A real melting pot of cultures and ideas. And it's interesting because this geographical shift, it kind of mirrors a spiritual shift, too.
How so?
Well, it's like by venturing out of Galilee, out of their comfort zone, Jesus is also venturing beyond the conventional religious thinking of the time.
He's expanding the map, so to speak.
Exactly. Pushing those boundaries, showing that his message, it's not confined to just one group of people.
It's universal.
Exactly. And there's this one teaching, it really highlights this idea. It happens while they're crossing a bridge in Sidon.
A bridge.
Yeah. Maybe one of the first bridges some of those disciples had ever seen, who knows. But anyway, Jesus uses it as a metaphor. He says, I'm paraphrasing here, this world is just a bridge you're passing through. Don't get too comfy and try to build a house on it.
Whoa. That's pretty powerful imagery.
Right. He's basically saying, don't get so caught up in the material world, in the here and now, that you forget about the bigger journey.
Don't lose sight of what really matters.
Yes. And this whole idea of spiritual progression, of not clinging to old ways of thinking, it's central to what he's teaching in Sidon.
Makes sense. So what's the vibe like in Sidon? Are people receptive to this message?
Oh, yeah. He ends up staying with this woman, Justa, and her mother, Bernice. And every morning he teaches, and people, they eat it up. The Urantia book actually says that many souls found new life and purpose through these teachings.
Wow, they were really hitting home, which again makes you wonder why this whole period is barely mentioned in the Gospels.
Right. You'd think it would be front page news. But it's almost like, I don't know, the success of his ministry among the Gentiles, it didn't fit the narrative that developed later.
Fascinating. So what else did he talk about during this time in Sidon?
Well, he spends a lot of time unpacking the whole idea of spiritual growth. How it's not a one-and-done deal, but this ongoing process.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And he stresses the importance of developing a conscience, but not just any conscience, one that's not just about avoiding guilt, but one that's overflowing with love.
There's that emphasis on love again. It really is the key to everything for him, isn't it?
It's the foundation. And, he connects this idea of love to forgiveness. Like they're inseparable. Well, he tells his disciples, if you want to experience eternal life, you got to stop holding on to anger and resentment. You got to forgive everyone, just like I've forgiven you.
Easier said than done.
Oh, tell me about it. Forgiveness is one of those things that sounds so simple in theory, but can be so darn hard to put into practice, especially when we've been hurt.
Absolutely. And I think that's why Jesus often used parables to get his point across.
It's like he met people where they were at, using stories and metaphors to make these big, sometimes difficult spiritual concepts relatable.
Totally. And speaking of parables, there's one that really stands out from this period.
You talk about the parable of the carpenter.
That's the one. It's just so perfect,
Yeah.
The fact that Jesus, a carpenter himself, would use this analogy to talk about building a strong inner foundation. It's brilliant.
It's such a vivid image, right? Choosing good, solid lumber, building on a firm foundation, so that when the storms come, and they will, you'll be able to withstand them.
Exactly. And he's not just talking about physical buildings here. He's talking about our inner lives, our character.
It's like he's saying that if we want to grow spiritually, we need to build on a solid foundation. Intellectually, morally, the whole package.
Because if our foundation is shaky, if our values are all over the place, how can we expect to weather the storms of doubt, temptation, all those curveballs life throws at us?
It will crumble.
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating conversation that takes place in Sidon. Nathanael, one of the disciples, he asks Jesus about that line in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation.
It's like, on the one hand, we're taught that God wouldn't do that, right? Put us in harm's way like that. But then we're praying it anyway.
It's a tough one, a real head scratcher for sure. And honestly, Jesus' response to Nathanael, it's actually really insightful.
What does he say?
Well, he kind of flips the script. He says that temptation, it doesn't come from outside of us, like some kind of test from God. It comes from within.
So it's not about God tempting us. It's about us, tempting ourselves.
Exactly. It's about our own desires, our own impulses, those things we wrestle with internally.
So we're not just victims here, at the mercy of these urges.
Not at all. We have agency, we have a choice in how we respond. We can either give in to those desires, let them control us, or we can choose a different path.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. But that's where the real work comes in, right? Recognizing those desires, those temptations, and then consciously choosing to direct our energy towards something better.
So it's not about suppressing everything we feel, more like transforming it.
Exactly. It's about taking that energy, that desire, and channeling it into something life-giving, something that aligns with our values.
So instead of getting bogged down in this constant willpower battle, we can focus on cultivating those qualities that naturally lead us away from temptation.
Love, compassion, forgiveness, those are the antidotes.
Powerful stuff. So it sounds like this whole idea of transformation, of spiritual growth, it's a major theme during this time in Phoenicia.
It's the common thread that ties it all together. And Jesus, he encourages his disciples to stay the course, not to get discouraged by setbacks.
Because, let's face it, setbacks happen to all of us.
All part of the journey, right? But he reminds them, our true worth, it goes way beyond those temporary bumps in the road.
It's about keeping that bigger picture in mind.
Exactly. And he also stresses the importance of taking care of ourselves, finding those moments of peace and quiet, even amidst the chaos of life.
Because that's how we recharge, how we connect with that inner wisdom, right?
Exactly. It's in those quiet moments that we can hear that still, small voice, that guidance from within.
It's like tuning out all the noise of the world so we can tune into something deeper.
And as we grow in that awareness, as we cultivate those qualities of love, compassion, forgiveness, we naturally start to embody them.
We become living examples.
Exactly. And that's how we make a real difference in the world. Not by preaching at people, but by living it out, letting our actions speak louder than words.
So powerful. Okay, so what happens next? They're in Phoenicia, they're teaching, things are going well. Do they just stay there indefinitely?
Well, they know they can't stay in Phoenicia forever. It's time to head back to Galilee.
But it sounds like things were pretty intense back there last time.
They were. So before they head back, Jesus, he makes an interesting decision.
What's that?
He decides to split the group up. The 12 evangelists go one way, the 12 apostles go another.
Interesting. Why do you think he did that?
Well, remember all that opposition they faced? This way, they can cover more ground, reach more people, without drawing too much attention to themselves.
It's like a strategic maneuver.
Exactly. And when they get back to Galilee, well, it seems like things had calmed down while they were gone.
People had moved on, forgotten their anger.
It seems that way. Of course, little did they know, Jesus would be back. And this time in Phoenicia, this time away, teaching, resting, recharging, it only strengthened his resolve.
Setting the stage for that final year of his mission.
A year that would change everything. And it really makes you think, what if those early gospel writers, what if they hadn't glossed over this period in Phoenicia?
What if they'd given it more attention?
How might it have changed our understanding of Jesus, of his message, his mission, to see how readily it was accepted by those outside the Jewish tradition?
It really makes you think.
It does. And, maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive. Sometimes the most profound truths, they're found in the most unexpected places.
The footnotes, so to speak.
Exactly. And when we open ourselves up to those different perspectives, we challenge our own assumptions, and that's when real growth happens.
So, as we wrap up here, I want to ask you, what are you taking away from this deep dive? What will you carry with you?
Well, I think for me, it's that reminder that spiritual growth, it's not a linear path. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and sometimes the detours, those unexpected turns, those are the most important part of the journey.
So well said. It's like Norana, remember her?
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to approach your faith with a little humor, a little boldness. Challenge the status quo. And when you stumble, because you will, don't get discouraged.
Forgive yourself, learn from it, and keep moving forward.
This world is just a bridge, but that doesn't mean we can't dance a little along the way, right?
Exactly. Embrace the journey, my friend.
Beautifully said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the often overlooked travels and teachings of Jesus in Phoenicia. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep those hearts open